Hello. 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 Can you hear me?
Hi everyone.
Hello, sir. We're just waiting for Mr. Imran Akhtar, and then we'll start in 2 minutes.
Okay. Am I visible? Audible?
Sir, you're audible but not visible.
Okay.
It says that we can't start our video because the host has stopped it. So it's a setting on your end that you may have to change.
Oh, let me
Please
fix
change
that.
your settings. Yeah.
Can you check now, please?
There we go.
Perfect. So everyone, we're going to start in like a minute.
Okay. Are we audible?
Yes, sir. You're also visible.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to a very interesting webinar titled Diplomacy in the 21st Century, hosted by IPRI. The world is fast changing, and with evolving modes of communication, digitalization, and data influence, diplomacy, like everything else, is also changing. This changing paradigm provides opportunities for smaller countries like Pakistan, which are in a fluid state and can adapt to changes very quickly. Thus, to discuss what does the changing times bode for Pakistan diplomatic discourse, we have a very eminent panel today. Our keynote speaker for today is Mr. Imran Akhtar, who is currently serving as advisor to the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, focusing on creating, developing, and sustaining a public diplomacy agenda for Pakistan with specific initiatives across economic, digital, cultural, and sports diplomacy. The panelists for today are Mr. Uzair Yunus. Uzair Yunus is a visiting senior policy analyst for South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He also hosts Pakistonomy, a weekly podcast covering economic developments in Pakistan. The second panelist is Ikra Ashraf, who is a practicing diplomat. She's currently the Director of Strategic Communications at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pakistan. The third speaker is Mr. Imran Ghazali, who is a digital media expert with over 14 years of experience and is currently working as General Manager at Digital Media Wing of Government of Pakistan. So before we start the webinar, a note for our viewers is to keep sending in your questions even during the course of the webinar, and we'll try to address the questions as much as possible. Without any further delay, I request our acting president, Brigadier Rashid Bali Janjua, to please give the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Kashum. I welcome all the distinguished panelists and participants on this webinar. Public diplomacy is sometimes referred to as cultivation of public opinion by governments in other countries. Now, it is nothing but effective public diplomacy, which is another word for a dialogue and not a sales pitch. So for that reason, it has to be a two-way street, which leverages the influence of important mediums of public communications like TV, films, music, sports, literary and cultural activities. So it's an eclectic mix and a potpourri of all, which is perceptions and shapes the opinions also. So in this age of communications, we are informed by Noam Chomsky and Professor Herman, about the power of manufactured consent. And we all know that there are famous 5 filters which they gave as to how the consent is manufactured, and which include ownership, advertising, official sources, flack, and marginalizing dissent. On ownership, we are all very clear that we can own or disown information based upon our own interests. And those who own the mediums, they have that liberty. Advertising, so this is also something that has become very important for the media, and whosoever pays for the advertising calls the tune. So that's also a reality which shapes and manufactures consent in this age. Then there are official sources, because information that has to be leaked by the governments in case of important events is through those sources. And whatever the sources tell, it shapes the opinions. The examples are during the Panama conflict in 1989, the information that was given by the official sources was of some 250 casualties, whereas the alternative sources were given another figure of 3,000. So it's very difficult to bridge the gap, especially once the strategic communication arteries are all controlled by the government resources. Now, then there is a filter of flack. Flack means that you earn the ire of those who have the clout. If you give an opinion or you send a news contrary to their interests, the examples are in front of us. A very famous example of in the United States of Wilson, who wrote an article in New York Times criticizing President Bush's Iraq war policies. And he was given, slap on the wrist in the shape of exposure of his wife's status as CIA spy, Valerie Plams. So those are the kind of strictures and those are the kind of constraints that hamstring opinion purveyors and opinion makers as well. The last filter is the marginalizing dissent. The dissent, those who depart from the officially peddled truth, they are sometimes marginalized through reprisals, through outright denial and blanketing of their, communication channels. But all said and done, it's just like an expanding torrent. The news, the information media, cultural diplomacy, it has all transcended those limits and barriers that are humanly capable of restricting the opinions and the news. So the Walter Lippmann's 1920s, coinage is still relevant today, and the consent is manufactured, and the best way is to be a part of that strategic communication channel, part of that public diplomacy, and part of those cultural and literary mediums that shape opinions at international level and national level. We're quite excited today. We have changed this format to make it more interactive. And I'm sure with this new format, we'll learn more. And I'm looking forward to a very exciting discourse. So with this, over to you, Kashun, to start the proceedings.
Thank you, sir. I now request Mr. Imran Akhtar for his keynote address.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum, and good to be here. And thank you, IPRI, for bringing us all together with a panel of young, vibrant doers. Do bear with me while I defer to my notes to deliver this keynote on diplomacy in the 21st century, as I have penned down my thoughts to ensure I'm as specific as possible and not unnecessarily long-winded. In fact, if I may set a parameter here, it is diplomacy in a COVID-19 world that really defines the 21st century. I take this one step further to suggest we categorize diplomacy into two clear areas, pre-COVID and post-COVID. It is in this framework to set the premise for today's discussion and to contextualize my comments to the Pakistan experience. Diplomacy by nature is multifaceted. I would argue that diplomacy has historically been looked at through a predominantly singular lens, and that is a political one. In fact, even in the realm of political relations, it is a robust public diplomacy strategy that dictates the strength and longevity of such relations. My belief is that diplomacy in the 21st century is far greater and more nuanced than simply building a base for political relations. Bearing this in mind, I'd like to draw upon our work with the foreign minister by way of illustrating my points with an example. I mean, after all, there's nothing worse than someone drooling on and on about theory and listing a litany of complaints isn't working and not having the work to back it up and the solutions to a way forward. Our work with the foreign minister commenced in late 2019, precisely with a view to broaden the strategic outlook, scope, and importantly, the tools of diplomacy under the foreign minister's vision. After all, and let me be very candid about this, we could not and cannot afford to operate on the values of a world that no longer exists. This echoes even more so now in a COVID-19 world. To this end, we identified public diplomacy as a key pillar of 21st century diplomacy, which we found has been mostly ignored in Pakistan. Three core additional areas of diplomacy on which to focus under larger public diplomacy agenda were chalked up as digital, economic, and cultural. We have thereafter worked to institutionalize the value of these three areas within the fabric of Pakistan's diplomatic DNA through an initiative called Vision FO. Just look at the panel we have today. In a way, your choice of panelists has validated this approach. Each person here represents one of the tiers on which we are focused: economic, digital, and cultural. And what you may ask, does economic, digital, and cultural diplomacy entail beyond a Qawwali night or a fashion show or a webinar, all packaged into a catchy hashtag with a 12-hour shelf life? Diplomatically speaking, and to quote what the foreign minister has often said, Pakistan's foreign policy is only going to be as successful as our economic strength and backbone. Therefore, economic diplomacy becomes a pivotal tool. Those checkbox meetings of councillors with mid-tier private company executives has naturally not reaped the benefit of trade and investment that Pakistan has needed. Positioning Pakistan as a geo-economic center with unparalleled regional connectivity has to come as a mindset top down. And that is what step one of economic diplomacy entails: resetting the existing geopolitical mindset and embracing the importance of geoeconomics. In fact, to share a small anecdote, in late 2019, we undertook the first economic diplomacy initiative for the foreign minister with a trip to the business capital in Karachi, with a view to cultivating the business community through their councils and chambers to engage more actively in export. Our intention thereafter was to continue the series of travels connecting businessmen to businessmen across cities and countries with clear KPIs. Then, as we know, came COVID. There was a clear choice to sit back and accept that our plans were indefinitely postponed and dead in water, or transform the idea. So we did. Which brings me to the significance of digital diplomacy in the 21st century. There is no doubt that COVID has accelerated the digital diplomacy trajectory. Diplomacy is no more singularly reliant on leadership to leadership telephone calls or state visits. Technology has never before played such a definitive role in relationships. Bilaterals, political consultations, multilateral conferences, you name it, is happening online. I would even go as far to say that digital diplomacy has outplayed traditional diplomacy in the post-COVID world. Today, wars are won and lost on Twitter. And what better place for economic diplomacy than online, where talk is fast but not necessarily cheap, where you use less resources to achieve greater outcomes in shorter amounts of time. What we did was to recognize that our ambassadors across the world are our greatest asset, and to work closely with our ambassadors to achieve set goals. So instead of waiting for COVID to ease and travel to resume, the foreign minister embarked on a series of regular meetings with all of our envoys abroad virtually, defining key goals for economic diplomacy with regular calendarized updates. And in turn, each mission is involved in daily virtual conversations with business communities across the world. Also, we saw Pakistan prioritizing digital alliances for greater economic exchange, entering, for instance, as founding member of Digital Cooperation Organization in record time for what would perhaps not been possible before. And if you allow me to spend a minute on digital communication, be it people to people, government to government, mission to mission, let me declare here that days of traditional media release are over. Unless we move to strategic communication, we won't be able to compete. We need a quick, strategic, and influential narrative. More and more of it are independent voices, influencers, digital stakeholders that are driving the conversation and in turn crafting mindsets. In this environment, it is forgivable for Pakistan's official voice and desired narrative not to be amplified effectively across social media in a manner that it is both timely and accurate. Without this, you lose the day to another or the chance to brand yourself where you want to be. Therefore, and I'm happy to share this with you, here today we use the start of a digital journey where almost every mission of Pakistan in every country and continent is online, engaging with their diaspora, local communities, public office holders, and so on. The newly formed Strategic Communication Division at the Foreign Office that works directly under the Foreign Minister, of which Ms. Ashraf here is a part, can share more about this. More with you about this, as I'm sure, as can Mr. Ghazali, also on the panel, a core member of our digital diplomacy journey. In fact, I would like to hand this over to our panelists soon, and therefore wouldn't speak as extensively on cultural diplomacy. But I will say everyone here is familiar with the old, almost tired refrain, we must present a soft image of Pakistan. What we instead need to focus on is how to use cultural diplomacy as a medium to build on people-to-people contact, to present the true image of Pakistan and interact on those values. What is it that connects us to others across the world? I mean, by way of a small example that came to light on a discussion of Pakistan's 70 years of diplomatic relations with Spain, which incidentally we are celebrating here. Did you know that the origins of flamenco music are found in the province of Sindh? Likewise, as we celebrate 70 years with 5 other countries, we look to identify the heritage that binds us and find ways to explore it together. In conclusion, diplomacy in the 21st century in a COVID world needs a multifaceted outlook and one that goes beyond the traditional. One that is cognizant of a world where relationships are changing and people-to-people contact made all the more accessible with digital growth. It is this multi-dimensional outlook and approach that will, I'm confident, open new vistas of Pakistan's footprint across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would also like to inform the audience that Mr. Imran Akhtar will be leaving us soon because of his work commitments at MOFA. But thank you so much, sir, for taking out time for this excellent and enlightening keynote address. With this, we move on to the panel discussion. And as Mr. Imran Akhtar pointed out, our panel reflects the nature of multi-layered diplomacy. International politics, as we know, is continuously in a flux. And it is in these COVID times that we are getting to truly experience this flux. The communication and technology revolution that is shaping the 21st century has given a powerful impetus to this particular way of conducting international relations. So, for instance, way back, like in 15 years ago, you would notice that diplomacy, if we were to picture diplomacy, it was seen as something rather men and women sitting at the table and doing negotiations. But in the COVID era, we are having rather less in-person interactions and we're moving toward digital diplomacy. And Imran, I would turn the discussion towards you. You have been working as a media and digital expert for over a quite long time. You would have seen that new digitalization is changing the nature of your work and setting a discourse in diplomacy rather. Also, Ikra, I think you can also relate that when you started off your career as a diplomat, digital was not as developed as it is now. how do you see the nature of your work essentially changing as opposed to maybe 10 years ago?
Thank you, Kashnood, and thanks, IPRI, for having me at this distinguished panel. It was very insightful opening remarks by Imran Sahab and Rashid Sahab. So, putting it into the context, if I just give you quickly the digital landscape of Pakistan, currently we have over 90 million people who have access to internet through 3G and 4G broadband networks. And there are around, according to the latest data, more than 45 million people have access to social media. They use social media in Pakistan. So, in the context, when we look at these numbers, overall, digital has become very important. A lot of people now have access and they use it to communicate. And when we look at in the context of digital diplomacy, again, the globally numbers have increased. A lot of people now have access to internet and social media. In like, the last few years, we have seen the diplomatic communication happening between the world leaders on Twitter. We have seen, how different, visits of the heads of states are actively pushed on social media. How the news actually, breaks on Twitter rather than coming up on the news channels. So, because of all these factors, digital has, of course, become very important in online regular communications, and especially in, the foreign affairs also. And, we have been working very closely with the Foreign Office, with the team at the Foreign Office. And I'm glad, that Pakistan is also now organizing itself, realizing the strategic importance of digital media. And in the last, few months, a lot of progress has been made in terms of organizing the presence of Pakistan's digital media, our missions on Twitter, on Facebook, on different platforms. So, and over the years, if you move back, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, there was almost no presence of, many countries. Hardly any country was present on social media this actively. And now, looking at it right now, it is the first thing that, normally the citizens do, and also the world leaders, whenever they have to put some message out there, it is, mostly communicated through social media, through Twitter. So that's why it's critically important. And I will, pass it on to IPRI to add on to it. And, later on, I'll also add. But I think there's a lot of progress that we've also made. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think we are heading in the right direction now.
Thank you, Imran. And thank you, IPRI, Kashon, and Janjwa Saab and Imran Saab for such an insightful conversation so far. And it's only just started, so it's very exciting that we'll see where it goes. It's very interesting that you mentioned the exact time period of 10 years, because that is the exact time that I've been in the service. So I can totally give you the landscape change that has happened in the past 10 years. I joined personally Twitter in 2012, which was the year I joined the Foreign Service Academy. And I hardly ever used it till my first posting in 2017, which was in France. And even then I had a locked account. So it's only in the past 2 years, and definitely, as Imran Saab mentioned, the post-COVID era has leapfrogged the diplomacy and the practice of diplomacy really into the 21st century. It's very fast-paced. As Ghazali Saab mentioned, the news breaks on Twitter, and we are struggling to keep up with the pace there because, of course, coming from government sources, the information has to be verifiable, the information has to be correct, it has to have the correct credentials. So this is a challenge, and this is the thing that is new for us, and that is keeping up with the pace of the media landscape and keeping up with the pace of diplomacy in the 21st century. For Foreign Office, it's very interesting, as has been mentioned several times already now. We have a total of 117 missions across the world, and after a very concerted effort, all of them, without any exception, are present and active on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we are leveraging these digital media assets, which is literally a new term, because we used to have political assets and we used to have cultural assets, and now we have digital media assets, and we are using and learning how to use these assets to the best of our abilities. And what is even interesting for Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that we are moving towards a paperless environment, which means that we are really stepping into the e-domain, and the gains which will be made from this step forward are huge, because when you have everything in the digital space, you save a lot on research, you save a lot in terms of man hours, you can collate big data, you can use AI tools, and you can actually map trends of certain topics, and you can put them on social media, use analytics to see what is gaining traction, what is it that is not gaining traction, and then you can improve on your messaging, on the way you're conducting your diplomacy. So it's, the means of communication are vast, and these sources at the disposal of the governments are vast as well, because now you can see what is formulating opinion, what are the responses, and how to leverage it to the best of your ability. So the landscape definitely in the past 10 years has taken a quantum leap forward, and it's a very exciting time indeed.
Thank you, Ikra. Uzair, I would like to take your take on this particular question. Ikra rightly pointed out that, a few years back, we didn't see the presence of foreign ministries on social media. And today we see Twitter diplomacy happening. So what is there with this changing times and with this changing data analytics coming up? Do we see anything similar for economic diplomacy or not?
Yeah, so Kashan, thank you, and thank you for organizing this discussion, for having me here. I'll speak from the perspective of the economic domain, and first up, like, why are we even talking about economic diplomacy now, and why is Pakistan keen to shift from a geopolitical to a geoeconomic model? Is very simple, and I'll cut to the chase here. It's because Pakistan doesn't want to keep going back to the IMF, and Pakistan wants to trade with the rest of the world and pave the path for sustainable economic growth. So whatever you do on the comm side, diplomacy side, understandably, the result will be measured in terms of, have your exports gone up if you're investing in diplomacy with the United States or China or Vietnam. If you're investing in economic diplomacy with the Gulf, have your remittance flows inched up? And even better, has FDI started to come into the country, because that brings up your supply side capacity and things like that. The problem in today's technological term, and I'll identify this because Imran and Ikra both very articulately pointed out the benefits of the technological shifts that are happening. The problem is that everything moves fast. And when everything moves fast, it means that you are chasing the next best story. Economic domain, things move slow. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you are going to focus on, let's say, telling the world and convincing the world that Pakistan is a great market to come and invest in, the underlying work on the product Pakistan side, the economic diplomacy is the brand Pakistan side, has to occur within Pakistan, and it moves slow. So you have to solve your electricity issues, your gas shortage issues, rule of law challenges, FDI frameworks, etc. Those things in any country, now Pakistan is not unique there, move slowly. So you can do a lot of work over 6 months and say, you know what, we're a great place for textile FDI to come in and set up textile manufacturing. And then 6 months plus 1 day after, the export industry comes out and says, we don't have gas and we're going to miss our order. So all of that economic diplomacy work that you did on the communication side is just gone. It just blows up. It's gone. And so I think what you have to have in this fast moving post-pandemic world is a very tight synergy between the comm side of your product or brand Pakistan with the product Pakistan side of things. And I can explore a bit more about what I mean by that. But essentially, so long as that is not the case, You can tell the world 100 times that Pakistan is a young market with a large middle class, but the reality of it will always wash over the hard work that folks like Imran or IPRI or others, even the Prime Minister, will be doing on Twitter, on social media, on comm strategy, because the product itself is weak. And I'll pause here, is that the geopolitical domain is a domain that the Pakistani machinery is built for and is very good for. And it's very easy to operate in that domain. You have a war going on. I'm going to make some deals, get the supply lines going, and get the funds and the aid and the assistance I need because there's a war going on. There are not a lot of alternatives. In the geoeconomic domain, you're competing with over 100 countries, all of whom are going to make the case that they're young, that their middle class is growing, and that they pose a market opportunity for foreign investors. You have to have something else on top of it. And the something else on top of it has to be linked very tightly to the product Pakistan side of the equation. And I think that's what we should focus on.
Zai, you made a very interesting point that while we're making some ambitious moves towards multi-layered diplomacy, we have certain constraints at home. So like you rightly pointed out, that we're trying to bring in foreign direct investment into Pakistan, but there are certain things that we need to change first at home. For example, you point out about electricity and the gas issues. And there's also one constraint that's pointed out by the investors, is that Pakistan needs to change its business environment and makes it more attractive to the investors. And these are the constraints that we get to hear, and we cannot move forward with economic diplomacy once we overcome these challenges. So I want to take our discussion forward and put out a question to all the panelists. What do you think are the roadblocks largely for the new goals that we are trying to reach out to? And not even just the idea of having economic diplomacy, even at the institutional levels. For example, when we're trying to look at digital diplomacy, our institutions need to be on board with it, right? So why don't we start with Uzair, how about you point out the challenges, and then we can move forward to digital diplomacy?
Yeah, so I'll put this in the framework of three big pillars that you need to think about in terms of meeting these challenges. And within each category, within each pillar, there are certain challenges that need to be identified and addressed, again, with very tight connection to the brand side of the conversation. The first is development. And I don't just mean basic human development, of which is a big part of it is human development. You cannot have a modern knowledge-based economy that is competitive in the 21st century where your youth literacy is hovering around 60, 70%. And if you raise the bar just a bit and add on critical thinking skills, et cetera, it just is one of the least skilled manpower bases in the world at this point in time. So, but beyond that, Pakistan is a diverse country. So when you think about economic diplomacy and say, I want to export to the world, the export equation in Skardu will be very different than the export equation coming out of Central Punjab. So let's just think Central Punjab, you can say dairy and livestock is a thing. Development of the dairy and livestock sector requires you to have a very distinct policy framework with incentives, with farmer education programs, and all sorts of stuff that go into it, including even robotics and drones, because that's where the world has gone with dairy. And then in Skardu with fruits and food processing, it's a very different policy environment. So you have to think about where are the competitive advantages that I can take advantage of the diversity and the breadth and depth of Pakistan to really grow my economic footprint in the world and trade with the rest of the world. And what am I offering? And let's discreetly develop each of these sectors. The second is diversity. And again, I'm ethnically Memon, so it's something that comes naturally to me because my grandfather would often be on a call and someone would call him and be like, don't do business with this person. And my grandfather would be like, I'm just doing business with them. I'm not marrying into this household, so I'm going to do business. And diversity is something Pakistan needs to think about, is the fact that you can have relations with everyone and anybody in the rest of the world, and that's how geoeconomics operates, so long as it's in your mutual beneficial interest, which is, am I getting money out of this relationship or not? That's at the core of it. But diversity is also about internal diversity. And there you have to think about the economic competitiveness region by region, district by district, and have a diverse approach to say, look, if we are dependent on textile exports for a number of decades for our exports. How do we diversify this mix? And what, again, it connects back to the development pillar, and how do we invest in that and attract investment? The third is the most important one, which is dependability. And dependability, again, going back to my grandfather, when someone would say, don't do business with this, he would ask two questions. One, does this person pay on time? And is this person an honorable person? And that's dependability in the geoeconomic world, which is that if I am a foreign investor and I come in and say, I'm going to invest $100 million in a motorcycle factory in Pakistan, are you going to give me certain tax rebates? Are you going to give me certain electricity surcharges, waive them off? Are you going to give me gas on time? And if you've agreed to it for the next 5 years, you can't go back 6 months later and say, I'm sorry, the IMF has come in, I need to do XYZ. And so the old deal is off the table and here's a new deal. That will scare away everyone for another 5 years. And I think that's very important for Pakistan to realize, is that it is very hard to build your reputation from a comm, and that this dependability is all about comms. From a comm strategy, it's very hard and takes a lot of hard work, but it takes a day to destroy it. And I think in the geoeconomic world, suppliers and global value chain investors do not care what happens in your country. If you've said you will make X number of products and deliver it by the end of March, if you're not able to, the order is not coming back and that relationship is gone. So I think that's how I would look at these pillars. And again, make sure that the economic diplomacy strategy is tightly linked to the things that need to happen on the ground, so that when the diplomats and the comms experts are pushing a perspective of Pakistan, of brand Pakistan, that product Pakistan is following in sync with that, so that there's no disconnect.
Yeah, so Uzair, you've pointed out a really good point, which is dependability. So while we're trying to make changes at home, we need to project it in a right way. And this is where I want to take, Imran, your take on this. We're making changes at home, but we also want to give a perception out, and that perception is going out through digital platforms. And this is where digital diplomacy come in. But what do you see are the roadblocks in achieving the goals of digital diplomacy? One, of course, is that there's a chasm between perception and reality, but also what do you see are the constraints?
So I agree with Uzair here. There's a lot of stuff that, there's still a lot of room for improvement. In Pakistan, all of us, a lot of people, keep on asking why the big technology companies, they don't open offices in Pakistan, why Twitter, Facebook, these social media tech giants, they don't come in Pakistan, why PayPal is not in Pakistan. So the question is for us, and the government to answer, like, do we have those, economic stability? Is that, the security that we are providing to these potential investors in Pakistan? And unfortunately, I think the things are still not conducive for them to be able to come in Pakistan. Apart from the economic opportunity for them to be able to come into Pakistan, we also need to ensure there is security. Actually, that is one of the biggest issues that they raise, in terms of coming to Pakistan. A lot of, we see a lot of political statements being made that, okay, we will bring Twitter or these social media platforms to invest in Pakistan and open offices in Pakistan. But the question to answer before that is, are we, in that position to be able to host them? And then related to technology also, with this, COVID episode, we have seen that a lot of students in Pakistan have suffered, in terms of accessing internet and getting online classes. So we still have a lot of work to be done in terms of, bringing the technology and the access part up to par, to be able to make it, a case where we are able to, welcome these kind of people to come in Pakistan. Secondly, I think in terms of our diplomacy and, our relationship with these platforms as a state. It's also, I think, from the Foreign Office, there is effort going on, which needs to continue, to be able to make them realize the potential of Pakistan. And there are some sensitive and serious issues, like, for example, we get a lot of uh, concerns from the citizens of Pakistan whenever they try to raise the issue of Kashmir online. A lot of their accounts get suspended. A lot of the content is taken down, even if they are just raising the human rights violation issues of India. And in that case, unfortunately, Twitter or some of these platforms are quite openly biased towards India because of the influence that they have on these platforms. So I think in some of these issues, Pakistan will have to make a lot more efforts to be able to make them realize, we are a sovereign country. These are the dynamics of a country, and make them understand. Looking at the positive side, I'll just give you an example. Recently, we all saw some of the photos came of Gwadar, a cricket ground in Gwadar, and we saw those just initially came on Twitter, and they became viral globally. A lot of people from across the globe started posting, and then uh, 2 weeks later we saw a match being hosted there, and now there's plans for like the PSL match, and there's a lot of economic activity attached to that. So there are cultural aspects that we can definitely promote through Twitter and through online mediums. It's just that there is a lot of work still that needs to be done on ground to be able to make that environment conducive for people to look Pakistan in that positive limelight.
Imran, you point out the biases that we see on the digital platforms, and we'll move on to that point in the later part of our discussion. But for now, I want to take IPRI into the discussion. And IPRI, you sit at a very unique place right now. You have been practicing traditional diplomacy, and now there's a renewed focus on public diplomacy. As our panelist also pointed out, diversity, it's a positive point for Pakistan that we have a very diverse culture. We've been working on cultural diplomacy. But however, the shift is not easy. We have an institution which is which follows a traditional approach. So how do you see, what do you think are the prerequisite changes or the constraints that need to be first addressed before moving on to the transition?
So first of all, I would like to disagree a little bit. I do not think that the institution is working in a traditional manner. And I also do not see a very natural bifurcation between the traditional diplomacy and the digital diplomacy. The reason is very simple. Let's start with why I think there is no such bifurcation. The reason is that what we call traditional diplomacy is something that happens and will continue to happen as long as diplomacy and interstate relations are there. Because many discussions, many negotiations, many meetings need to take place in a very structured manner behind closed doors. And digital diplomacy or the fast-paced nature of diplomacy only comes in the post-meeting stage and in the pre-meeting stage. But the meeting itself remains important. So let's not completely discard the traditional diplomacy. It is here to stay. But what is important to really understand is that the nature of diplomacy has evolved. So a diplomat has a greater toolkit at his or her disposal now. So for me, Uzair gave 3 reasons why, and I'm going to take lead on that and give you 3 reasons why I think we are having some troubles in this transition or in this period. Number 1 is human resource. I do not know whether this is common knowledge or not. Pakistani diplomats man 117 missions. The headquarters at Ministry of Foreign Affairs Islamabad and camp offices in Quetta, Peshawar, Karachi, and Lahore. And we do it with a collective strength of less than 400 people. So at any given time, any Pakistani diplomat is working multiple hats and is doing a stellar job of that. So for me, a big thing that we need to look at is how to develop this small human resource and enable this human resource to channel its energies towards the digital side, as well as the traditional side, as well as the cultural side, as well as the economic side, as well as the science side, because we have so many facets of diplomacy available now. So one big challenge is the human resource training, because I think it is very, very important, and it is something that we really need to focus on and are focusing on, because of course this is a natural first reaction of when you step into this digital world, and how do you train your diplomats to deal with the challenges of this digital world. Number two is that we have to invest in an appropriate digital infrastructure. We have been undertaking very exciting work at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, combined with Ministry of Information. Ghazali Saab has been very forthcoming, very kind. In that, we developed our digital social media, digital assets, and we are trying to make it even more palatable and even more stronger, and to establish that value chain that is very, very necessary in order to translate gains in diplomacy into the digital sphere as well. And number three, what we really need is, again, borrowing from what Uzair already said, brand Pakistan. So public diplomacy has to have an overarching strategic overthink. This is what Imran Saab said, talked about in his keynote address as well, that it isn't about just arranging Qawwali concerts and letting it go at that. No, there is a reason why those Qawwali concerts are being arranged. And that reason is that we want to give a targeted, consistent, continuous, creative message through all our assets abroad and at home to an audience which is there for a reason. So this reason needs to be thought out, and the strategic overthink needs to be there in order to actually develop brand Pakistan. So I think that the efforts are certainly being made in the right direction, but the gains are yet to be seen, because it is a long-term continuous process. And I am very happy to tell you and share with you that we are on the right path, and we are very excited, and we are completely on board. And we are definitely seeing where we are going, and that remains very, very important, to know what the end result is. Only then can you really lay down the path to achieve it. So for me, these three remain challenges which are actually known to us and on which we are working as we speak as well. So I'm very, very excited for whatever lays ahead.
So Ikra, I agree with you on the point when you say that back channel diplomacy and Twitter diplomacy kind of go parallel with each other. And that kinds of give Pakistan a open set of instruments to work on, to gain larger diplomatic pursuits. And with this, I move our discussion further and open the discussion with a larger question, that is, with Pakistan having larger instruments for diplomatic gains, what do you think are the major opportunities for Pakistan? What needs to be prioritized at this point? And I would ask Imran to go ahead with this.
Thanks, Kishan. Can you please repeat the question? Sorry, I was just reading the questions on the panel.
So, building on what Ikra said, that Pakistan now has a larger toolkit for following its diplomatic pursuits. So with Pakistan having multi-layered instruments in order to make gains, what do you think are the major opportunities for Pakistan? For example, with digital diplomacy, what are the opportunities that lie ahead for Pakistan?
Yeah. Thanks. I think, as Ikra also mentioned initially, these digital media assets are also the strategic assets for us in this day and age. And just to give you an example, the Prime Minister's Office Twitter account for Pakistan, this was started in 2018. Before that, there was no presence of Pakistan in terms of the Prime Minister office on Twitter. And now this account has 1.6 million followers, and it is followed by the heads of states in different countries and, the international journalists, the diplomatic community. So it has become a strategic asset of Pakistan, which is only going to grow and get better and stronger. And in the similar lines, as ICRA has mentioned, the Foreign Office is also working on organizing and strengthening the digital presence of Foreign Office. So I think few key objectives that we want to achieve with that. One is, as we all say, and want Pakistan's real image to be portrayed, still in the international media, or if you do a Google search on Pakistan, a lot of like negativity comes up. So that's one of the things. When these missions are going to be organized, they're going to be promoting the culture of Pakistan, what exactly is happening in terms of, the progressive developments that we're doing in Pakistan, the technology developments that are happening in Pakistan. There's a lot of, recently we see in the tech startups, there's a lot of companies and young people are coming up with different ideas. So I think those are the things we will be able to portray in a better way once we are strategically aligned and organized in the next few months, inshallah. And then, as we also talk about, unfortunately, due to COVID, the tourism part could not be, the government's plan to work on the tourism industry could not be expanded as it was expected due to COVID. But I think that is another thing. In 2021, the government formally plans to launch the Brand Pakistan initiative, through which, as the Prime Minister also says, there's huge potential to, earn through tourism in Pakistan. And there's, we all know there's a lot of sites in Pakistan which can be promoted. And again, these digital social media assets will be the important tools which we will use, to promote and sell that aspect of Pakistan. And then, in terms of, how ICRA has mentioned, I think the government of Pakistan overall is moving towards digital transformation. It is a complicated and difficult process, as the traditional processes are going on for so many years. Even in the Ministry of Information, this digital media wing is a new initiative, and it was only started 6 months ago. And apart from that, now the PROs who are situated in different ministries, we will be also training them on digital media. And then we are also coming up with a internship program in which a batch of 100 young people will be inducted in different ministries, and they will be also enhancing the capability of different ministries on digital media. So I think with some of these prime initiatives, and then we also know the government is working on e-filing and digital transformation, in which the processes can be transparent, and there's can be more efficiency into all of this. So with all of these things in place, I think we will be able to market ourselves better in the world, and I think we are slowly but surely moving in the right direction in that sense.
Imran, I think the internship program in every ministry is going to solve the human resource problem, as ICRA pointed out. So ICRA, what do you think? You've been working on the public diplomacy program. What do you think are the larger opportunities that lie ahead for Pakistan?
So the biggest opportunity and the biggest dividend of public diplomacy is, as Ghazali Saab mentioned, is projecting the real image of Pakistan. So when earlier there used to be this discourse on projecting the soft image of Pakistan, I have an inherent problem with the usage of this term soft image, because projection of soft image means that you're trying to project something, you're really having to try hard to project something. Whereas for Pakistan and for Pakistanis in general, what has consistently been a tagline is that once you visit Pakistan, you get to see Pakistan beyond headlines. So the real image of Pakistan is the soft image of Pakistan. So the biggest dividend and the biggest opportunity that we have in terms of public diplomacy is putting across this real image of Pakistan as a country with diversity in terms of its people, in terms of the landscapes, in terms of its geography, in terms of its culture, its cuisine, you name it, and you get all these cultural assets that are already in place. So public diplomacy intends to leverage these assets and to showcase them in a manner which is palatable, in a manner which is effective and is communicated well to a select group of audiences. This can be, the people in our host countries. This can be diplomats posted in Pakistan. This can be through student exchange programs. This can be through art exchange programs. This can be through exchange of cultural troupes, and the list goes on and on. So for us, this remains a priority, and it also remains a big dividend that we want to project this real image of Pakistan, and that is the aim of public diplomacy in an overarching manner. As far as the areas that need to be prioritized, I will circle back again to the point about human resource and about the digital toolkit. So we do need, as a priority, we need to train our human resource, and we have programs in the pipelines for that. And we also have to invest in a digital toolkit. Now, this is something which is new for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because so far we have been able to get by developing infographics recently, and that also started very recently under Strategic Communications Division, which I joined a couple of months back and has been in place only since last year under the Vision FO of the Foreign Minister. So what we really need to invest in is a digital toolkit. And in that toolkit, we want to go far beyond just compressing press releases into bite-sized information, which is palatable, which is shareable across platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And we want to reach a wide array of audiences, and that is great. But we also need to move far beyond this into the strategic realm of things, in which we're able to map trends, in which we are able to tag along big data and to analyze what is gaining traction, as I earlier said, and what is it that needs to be worked on more, what messaging is effective, and how to boost that messaging in a particular area with a particular audience. So in order to do that, we need to have a digital toolkit available of artificial intelligence softwares. We need to have softwares which can help us in this trend analysis, and we need to have people who are able to read these trends and then map these trends and then put them across to policy and decision makers in a manner which can aid that policy and decision making. So currently we are relying on traditional means in developing our policies, but we see a vast array of opportunity available to us if we move into the digital space.
Thank you, Ikra. Uzair, I want to bring you into the discussion. And government of Pakistan is focusing onto economic diplomacy, and that seems to become the talk of the town. But why do you think it's so important for Pakistan to pursue economic diplomacy? Can we map some gains out of it?
I mean, yeah, of course. I think there are three big gains, right? The first and most immediate gain is macroeconomic stability. Only by trading with the rest of the world and selling them more of your diverse products and your ingenuity in your human resources can you bring in the dollars that you need to sustain your growth projections and sustain your economy long term. And we've seen the cost of that, not being able to do that over the last two and a half decades, where over the course of the 21st century, Pakistan, which was per capita the richest when you compare it to India, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, is now the poorest. So that's number one. Number two is that the world is at an inflection point where there is big technological transformation happening in a world that is quickly becoming multipolar, which means that there is no determined path towards the winners in the future or the losers in the future. In fact, I will argue that based on my own assessment of where the world is going, that the old model of industrial development, aka what China did or what Bangladesh did in terms of female employment, or what Vietnam has done over the last few years and South Korea, is not going to work. You cannot take millions of people and put them into factories anymore and hope that the production and manufacturing side of the equation will lift them out of poverty, because the world is automated now. The world is switching into distinct global value chains that do not rely a lot on that type of labor. So you have that's the other benefit of attracting investment, is that you try to leapfrog ahead and find the best and most sustainable path forward for yourself. And I think the third is that Pakistan has to redefine itself. And that's why we're having this conversation, right? It has to redefine itself from a geopolitically important country to a geoeconomically important country. And to do that, you have to do certain things that change the very fundamental nature of how your state operates and what its outlook is towards the rest of the world. I would say that when you think about this equation in the economic diplomacy realm, the audience is very limited, which is a huge opportunity. The investment or geoeconomic audience niche for Pakistan are basically fund managers, large companies, global business press, and the international business press, both in terms of domestic and global on the business side. Now you have to target them in a way that you consistently tell a story about how the country is reforming in not everything can't be done at the same time, but whatever you identify is the most critical development need for the time being in the short and medium term. And once you capture that imagination, everything starts flowing backwards from there. And the reason why I say this is, again, as with someone who's advised large companies on accessing and investing in global markets, is the first filter is where Pakistan just falls through the crack. And the first filter is this: a 25 or 28-year-old analyst will be given a task by their manager to say, we're trying to open a new factory to make shoes. Let's say it's about shoes. Tell me what are the top 10 countries that I should consider as my initial set of analysis before I dive deeper. So this analyst will go and look at rule of law ratings. He or she will look at ease of doing business ratings. He or she will look at other World Economic Forum and press freedom and other types of reports and say, here are the top 10. And Pakistan, given where it is and given the progress it hasn't made in all these rankings, it will either be at the bottom side of the top 10 or not be in the top 10, because there is Rwanda, there's Ethiopia, there's Bangladesh, etc. And so once you start having your eye on the prize, that long-term eye on the prize, not just about perception, it's about changing the reality on the ground, which feeds into that perception. And there's a loop there. You start moving towards something that is far more sustainable in terms of your economic ambitions. And I think that's happening. So if you look at what's happened in the last few years, Pakistan, at least from my vantage point in DC, has gone from being in the global newspapers every day for some terrorist attack or some sort of issue whatsoever, to not being there. And not being in the headlines is actually a good thing, because that gives you the space to do the hard work below the radar and engage with your target audiences below the radar, and then capture their imagination and say, look, we were missing from the equation because we were doing the hard work. And now here we are with the top 3 things that we're trying to seek investment in and grow our economy on. And here's the value proposition that we're bringing to you. Again, brand Pakistan is very tightly connected to product Pakistan in that sense. And that's the approach I think we need to have, where the business private sector side, the government and the comm side come together and say, what is the thing that we need? What's the prize? And let's keep our eye on the prize and move forward towards achieving it.
Uzair, you make some really excellent points, and I want to dive deeper into the discussion of economic diplomacy. For instance, you make this point of redefining Pakistan, and we are also at this point of redefining our relationships with important partners at the global stage. For instance, US-Pakistan relationship, the conversations have largely been about Afghanistan or nuclear subjects. But now, lately, the conversation and the discussion has been shaking up a bit, and there's a renewed focus on economic diplomacy and economic partnerships, as we say so. However, what do you think? I mean, how can Pakistan transform its relationship with US from a security partner to economic partner? I mean, it's an ambitious goal, but what do you think? Like, how could we transform it, and if that's possible at all?
So I think I'll use the comparison with China to make my point here. When you look at Pakistan-China relations and the way the Chinese operate, the G to G relationship is the one that drives the flow of dollars. So if the Chinese government decides that Pakistan is a key anchor of the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese money will follow suit. The American beast is a very different one. When it's talking about security, it follows the G2G approach. But when it's talking about the economic lens, the Chamber of Commerce is what leads the US government into a particular relationship. And I think that's where the state, again, as I said, we're built for geopolitics, not geoeconomics. That thinking has to evolve and say that the strategic dialogue with the United States should continue. Bilateral ties should be discussed. Market access issues, whatever is there on the table, needs to be discussed on a G2G level. But the real momentum and the thrust of the momentum will come from the business to business communications. And that is where I think we've been lacking so far, is that Pakistan has not been able to capture the imagination of not only the American business community and the business press, but the global business community and the global business press writ large. And that is where the work needs to happen. And I think if you figure that out, and again, there are green shoots there, the key one being technology, which is that Pakistani diaspora in Silicon Valley is highly successful. It has driven millions of dollars of inflows into Pakistani startups just over the last 18 months or so. And so that is a green shoot. You can build on that and again, expand from that base. But again, the public diplomacy side of the equation will have to be tailored a bit for this different type of beast, which is the US Chamber of Commerce and the US or European investors. And they speak a different language. They don't look at just government to government strategic dialogue. They will look at that for signals, but by and large, they will look at, am I going to have a better business environment and higher rate of return and a more sustainable investment in a Pakistan or a Bangladesh or a Vietnam or in India? And I think that's, to convince them, you have to take a different approach.
Uzair, you also made a point that initially Pakistan used to be in the headlines of the global papers for on topics such as terrorism, but now it has gone to not being in the headlines at all, and that's kind of a good point for us. And now we want to shift from not being in headlines to a point where we are in the headlines for all the good reasons, and I want to bring in the subject of tourism here. And we know that tourism, as one of the panelists also pointed out, that tourism is going to impact our economy. And Uzair, you also mentioned that the investors that come in and the people, the soft image that we project out, the people do not, how do you see the tourism could impact our economy? And IPRI, I also want to take your insight into this, that while the foreign ministry is working on the tourism program, what are the reforms that you're taking, or what are the priorities for the tourism program?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. So tourism has been one of the leading flagship projects for the present government under the leadership of Prime Minister Imran Khan, and it has had a very strong impact in terms of our diplomatic outreach as well, and also in terms of people coming into Pakistan. The project has faced a bit of a setback because of COVID, but in the past 2 years, we've seen a very robust and healthy tourism industry springing up in Pakistan. And this has been supported by all our missions abroad in terms of projecting the opportunities available for tourism. I'll give you a small example of when I was in France. Since the government came in, we were told that tourism is a big agenda on the government's list. So we have to actually make it happen and to disperse this information across our networks. And this happened not just in France, but all across the globe, wherever our missions were. So in France, what we did was, and it was a very successful model, that we took a tour operators group of around 12 leading French tour operators, and we sent them to Pakistan in 2019. And what that achieved was that we connected the tourism industries of the two countries. So this was one way in which we saw very healthy results. So the visa requests for tourism increased by 300% in our mission in France alone. And because now the tour operators in France knew the infrastructure and knew the people and faces in Pakistan, they could design their tour elements and they could sell that to the public in France. And that achieved very tangible results. What we also did was that we made a dedicated website which was specifically and only on tourism, and we made it in French so that it is accessible to the local public. And then what we did was that we used all the resources available in terms of provincial tourism departments, hotels, boutique hotels, um, history, museums, all these stakeholders were put together in that one website, and that became a one-stop resource for any French tourist who, even if was not going through a tour operator, to be able to easily go for tourism to Pakistan. Another big step forward that this government has taken, and where Foreign Office has been involved, is in liberalizing of the visa regimes. Because it used to be a big problem for tourists to get a Pakistani visa because of the NOCs that were required, for example, to go towards the northern areas. So now the visa regime has been liberalized to an extent that when a potential tourist or a potential applicant wants to go to Pakistan, all they have to do is that they have to log in to the e-visa portal and apply for an e-visa. So these are some of the very tangible steps that have been taken in the recent past and which have translated into gains for Pakistan's tourism industry. But having said that, I think it remains important that we put this in context that the tourism industry is very, very nascent. And repeatedly, missions abroad have sent in these recommendations, these proposals, and I'm sure these have been resonating across the government circles that the tourism industry needs to develop further, and we need to put in place a tourism infrastructure if we really want to bring in the numbers. Because we have the landscapes, we have the hospitality, we have the food, but we need to have infrastructure which makes tourism sustainable and which makes it in a way that, you know, a big selling point for tourism in Pakistan is the northern areas, and a bigger selling point is that in the northern areas we have the highest density of ice caps outside of the polar ice caps, because we have these uncountable 5,000er, 6,000er peaks, and we have these big glaciers, and we have this untouched, pristine landscape. So in order to make this selling point remain a selling point, we need to ensure that this pristine landscape is preserved in a way which is not impacted by mass tourism, because we've seen images we've seen images coming out from Nepal a couple of years back where you saw that the highest mountain was just packed with these, you know, rows and rows of mountaineers, and that was actually not a very good image to come out. Despite the fact that you're getting numbers, you do not want that sort of image projection. So it is very, very important that while we all as arms of government are working our hardest to get the numbers in, because we have a great potential in the tourism industry, that we really invest in the industry itself. As Uzair keeps saying that brand Pakistan can only be as important as the product Pakistan. So the product side of things is as important as the branding. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is there for the branding portion, but it can be only as good and as strong as the product itself. So we really need to concentrate on the product, and the branding will eventually follow, because branding is actually, you know, it is easier because you can do it in a very short amount of time. But in order to develop that product, it needs time and it needs effort and it needs a very strong continuous um, effort. So we really need to keep all of these points in mind.
Uzair, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I think Ikra made really fantastic points just on tourism alone. I would, again, bucket this on the infrastructure side. It is huge, right? Again, why is this very important? Because it brings in US dollars. Pakistan needs US dollars. Anything that brings in US dollars, we should celebrate in a sustainable manner. I think we'll all agree on that. On the tourism side in particular, again, you have to understand that the person from France or Europe who wants to go see the northern areas in winter is a very different and a very small niche of the global tourism industry than the one who may want to come to Lahore to see the historic Mughal sites of Lahore, or to do other types of adventure tourism, or to go to Makran and go to Balochistan to see like untouched beauty. So, or someone who wants to go to Karachi, although Karachi should not be on the map given the state of the affairs of the city. But again, there are certain things on the infrastructure side you need to build, right? So I will say three things that you can, again, to reinforce Ikrar's point on, on the product side. First up, when a tourist comes to Pakistan, you want to make sure they don't fall sick after eating terrible food. How do you make sure? And that's not important because their experience is terrible. It's important because if someone's here for 7 days and 3 days of them are spent at home at diarrhea, that's $100, $200, $300 of money they would not spend by going out during that time, right? So it's about money. So you need to say, okay, if I have these 5 priority tourism zones, can I have a food safety authority actually doing its job there, so that when someone goes to eat parathas outside on the street, they have a rating that says this is A rated, so they feel comfortable and they can eat and enjoy the food and enjoy their experience in Pakistan. Number 2, cash is not, the world has moved on from cash, especially in COVID. Can you accelerate digitization of these small vendors again, so that they get a share of the money coming in? And number 3, when you talk about building tourism infrastructure, technology is taking us in terms of the future towards democratized commerce, democratized transactions, etc. Airbnb is a case in point. So the large hotels that you may want to build will take a long period of time, but can you have engagement with platforms like Airbnb that say, look, we're here, we have a cohesive tourism promotion, policy, and we'd love for you to onboard 5, 10, 15,000 hosts across these key 5 zones and train them and equip them. And oh, by the way, the government of Pakistan will provide X dollars per host in terms of soft loans to make sure they can upgrade and look nice and etc. Now, all of a sudden, you're building your tourism infrastructure for the future economy. And all of a sudden, someone goes into Airbnb and types Pakistan, finds 10,000 hosts and say, okay, wait a minute, I can actually go to this country and have a great time, spend my money, and all of a sudden, tourism dollars start flowing in.
Right. Uzair, I think that we're past that point where we wanted US dollars. Now we're on a road to self-sufficiency, and it will take a time, but we'll get there. Moving forward with the discussion, and this is a very interesting and engaging discussion, and I hope our viewers are as engaged as I am. Moving forward, we live in the time where, in the age of disinformation and fake news, and we recently saw that in the form of Indian chronicles that came out, and we even saw credible evidence of disinformation campaigns that were coming out from India. Imran, I want to bring you in onto this. In this age of disinformation, how do you prepare the nation to be resilient against fake news, one? And two, how do you prepare the institutions to fight disinformation warfare? And we know that a larger component of digital diplomacy is to combat information warfare. So could you give us an insight over that? Could you give us possible case studies?
Yep. This is actually one of the most critical points, or one of the biggest challenge that we face every day in terms of local or international context. The issue of fake news, propaganda based initiatives coming from different countries. One of the things that we are working on, and in terms of our coordination with these social media platforms, is the verification of the official assets of government of Pakistan, and that also includes foreign mission assets, and that actually helps. Once we have these official accounts proactively giving the official stance of the government or on different issues, giving out authentic news and information. Whenever there's a vacuum, it creates the opportunity for the fake news or disinformation to spread. So strategically, one of the initiatives to tackle this, counter this fake news, is to have a very proactive communication strategy in which we have all these official accounts disseminating the authentic information. And then other than that, it's also about exposing these kinds of networks which are, working against state of Pakistan. And recently with the EU Disinfo Chronicles, we've also seen, how a network of these fake propaganda accounts were operating from India, and through their collaboration. And I think in that episode, once it was it was discredited by a third party, because if we as Pakistanis keep making noise about it or highlighting it, it's not taking up that seriously. So it's also important that there are these issues are raised by independent third-party organizations, and then we take it to the platforms area. So in the case of EU Disinfo, Foreign Office, and the state of Pakistan also took this up to the UN to take notice of that. And in terms of educating our own citizens, it's very important to create awareness about some of these evil designs which are continuously working to create negative stories out of Pakistan's. And again, this is very challenging. We come across this almost on an everyday basis, and it's all about proactively communicating the official stance of the government on these issues. Then and it's a bit complicated in terms of again, as I also mentioned earlier, some of the biasness of these platforms towards some countries also. We've also noticed that very clearly in the recent episode, on the Kashmir Solidarity Day. A lot of people raising these issues on the human rights violations side, but still, their content is taken down, their accounts are taken down. And I think this is a continuous effort that we will have to make in terms of also educating the people and highlighting whenever we see these kind of biasness over there. This issue of fake news and disinformation, we have to discredit these kind of platforms which are also working from within Pakistan. And I think IPRI is also doing a good job in terms of highlighting some of these networks which are working. So I think more institutions with the credibility need to highlight and with the evidence show how these networks are operating, and what kind of propaganda points they pick up, the negative stories they pick up, and then propagate across Pakistan. So this is something, it's an ongoing challenge, and we, I think, proactively taking this on. Some of the steps that we have recently taken definitely has helped us in terms of disseminating the authentic news and information. And I think there's also a need of a third party credible organization within Pakistan, because in the other countries in the world, there's AFP fact checker or other organizations which are actually doing the fact checking. But in Pakistan currently, we do not have a active third party organization which deals with this issue. So that's also something that we need to, I think, with all the stakeholders taking them on board, the news organizations taking them on board, and need to build that kind of platform which has a credibility and then takes on the issue of fake news.
Thank you, Imran. With this, we move to the end of our panel discussion, which was a very interesting one. Before we proceed to the question and answer session, I want to take on our Executive Director, Dr. Hussain Nadeem, to make a comment.
Hi, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. I actually don't have any comment. I have questions, and I'm using my privilege of the Executive Director of Stratcom Executive Communications to ask some blunt question. Since we are short on time, and this was a beautiful conversation, I think I learned a lot on almost every single matter. My question is to all three of you, and it's more definitional question. Now, we're all kind of connected to a Stratcom industry, and we've been working on strategic communications, but it's become a buzzword, and anything that becomes a buzzword in Islamabad, everything goes on that, under that rug. So you have people doing communications on strategic issues, thinking that it's Stratcom. You have people doing marketing, thinking it's Stratcom. And on almost all the meetings that I sit on to, and I'm sure that's your experience, there's a definitional confusion on exactly what constitutes Stratcom and how to go about doing that. My question to all three of you is that, how in your own personal work do you really define Stratcom? One. And second, just a sub question on that is that, to me, Stratcom is essentially all about coordination. So my question is, how coordinated, and this is for Imran and Ikra, both of you, how coordinated are you within your own institutions and across the other institutions in the Stratcom industry in Pakistan? So if you can start off with any one of you, maybe.
I
Ikra?
think I go first because I unmuted myself first, so it's the buzzer that I pressed. So as far as the definition goes, definitions are always difficult and definitions are always strange because they tend to box you in. So I don't think that we really have a definition for strategic communications. Why strategic communications was put in place in Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in reaction to something that was needed. And what was needed was a way to communicate Ministry of Foreign Affairs messages and the stance of government of Pakistan in a manner which is palatable, in a manner which is effective, in a manner which is digestible for audiences across the world. And so we have the traditional press releases, and I know Hussein is no fan of press releases. So the idea was to transform the press releases or any of these so-called boring government messaging and long documents into smaller bites. So as far as Ministry of Foreign Affairs is concerned, strategic communication at the most basic level is an exercise in effective communication. And effective communication which is timely as well. Effective communication which is coordinated across the globe for all of our digital assets, across all of our missions presence in all the 117 countries that we are currently present in. So basically, as far as strategic communication goes for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it is very well coordinated within the ministry and within our network of missions abroad right now. This was not the case even a few months back. So it is a huge step forward. And it is a step forward because there's this inclination towards recognizing that we need to move in this particular direction. So the coordination is there and the messaging is there, and our attempt is to make it more targeted, more effective, more timely, and more attractive so that the message that goes out from Pakistan gains attraction in the target audience and is listened and heard to in a very timely manner so that it gains us some tangible results.
So I think, Hussein, you've raised a very interesting and important issue here. In terms of our coordination, I think we're definitely getting better. So, in the past recent months, we have coordination with the Foreign Office now, with some of the ministries who are a bit proactive. We do have links with them, but I think it is still not up to the mark. There's a lot that needs to be done. Again, I actually will agree with you. The tradition of issuing the press releases, it's not effective. But the people who are working within different ministries as PROs or as the media in charge, they're kind of used to using those traditional ways of getting the information out. I personally think it is more critically important for them to be active on the Twitter handles, and disseminating that kind of information on Twitter and on social media, rather than issuing the press release, which maybe does not even get published in most of the newspapers. And then the question is, how many people do read the traditional newspapers or even online newspapers? So I think in terms of coordination, yes, I would say about still, I would say we are just like 30-40% there. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And in this new initiative that we're coming up with, the inducting of 100 interns, and there will be at least 2 or 3 interns within each ministries, we're hoping they will definitely fill this gap and will be able to build the capacity of the people who are working there. And from our ministry, we are also highlighting this and working on a program to train the people who are already in these positions to be fully equipped with the digital tools, so that they are efficient in using them. And that is something that we really have to do in the next few months to be able to really make the difference. So it's a challenge, but I think we are at least concerned about it, and the senior leadership of the government is also looking into improving this. So we hopefully will be, getting there soon.
I would just like, I'm sorry, to add to this a little bit further. As far as press releases are concerned, again, this is the thought that I started off with at the beginning of the discussion, that traditional diplomacy versus digital diplomacy is not really a fight between the two. They actually complement each other. So press releases are very, very important because, there is a target audience, which can be the diplomats, which can be other countries, which are interested in those particular issues, which actually read every single line and every single word of that press release from a diplomatic point of view to understand where Pakistan stands on a particular issue. Now, the press release itself is important and it does not get published in newspapers at all. It gets published on Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and we have an entire archive of those press releases. But the important point here is to take this press release forward and put it in a palatable way across the social media assets as well, so that the message is not just within those very saturated circles which are political or diplomatic in nature, but the target audience then increases across the world and in a manner which is understandable for them. So there is a natural synergy between the two, and I think that is very, very important to understand.
Thank you, Ikra. Uzair, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not from the strategic comms or anywhere remotely close to the comms side of the equation, but as a consultant who works with senior executives, look, strategic communications, there's internal and external too. And the way I'll frame it is, if I'm having a business pitch meeting to sell my work to a client, I will take a look at the fact that their senior executive means they're busy. They will not do a lot of reading. And so I want to make my presentation concise and to the point. And I will try to communicate to them in a language that is relevant to what I'm talking about. So if I'm here on this panel, and if I, instead of talking about economic diplomacy, start talking about, I don't know, what's going on with the Biden administration, that defeats the purpose, right? Strategic communications, the way I see it, is basically what Ikra said, like, you have to be effective at your message delivered and keep your eye on the ball. And I think long-term strategic communication has to be consistent with that approach as well. So if you're talking about economic diplomacy, whether it's in the press release format or on social media or video or infographics, it all has to be consistent, so that someone who does not follow this thing and puts it in Google finds out the press release, finds the video link, finds the infographic, they all reinforce that one message. And I think if you're doing that and moving towards a strategic goal that you've identified, then communications is just part of the equation that helps you solve for that problem.
Thank you, Uzair. And with this, we move to the question answer session. And we have a number of questions from our participants. And the first question is from Osama, who is a researcher at IPRI. And his question is that tech has enabled states to adopt a decentralized approach to governance-related issues. How can Pakistan do things differently by adopting decentralized approach to diplomacy to enable participation of citizens, for example, as governments institutions usually do world over through tech by using hackathons to solve governance-related issues? Can a similar approach be adopted to diplomacy-related challenges that are faced by Pakistan? Any of the panelists could answer this question.
So I think this is a very good idea, and to some extent, these hackathons have started happening. And I know we engaged Facebook and conducted a hackathon to see how technology can be used on SARS program, some of the communication program for SARS, the poverty alleviation initiative of the government. There's definitely a need to do it in a, I think, more organized and collaborative manner, especially when we talk about promoting tourism of Pakistan. I think that's something where we can definitely crowdsource, involve people, come up with initiatives in which the citizens can also, pool in and contribute and use the technology. Similarly, in the recent incident of Ali Satpara, we saw the whole global community of mountaineering got involved and talked about it. And I think in all of that incident, probably for the first time ever, people looked at the scope of mountaineering in Pakistan. And that way, it was highlighted. So I think I totally agree with this, and we will actually work with the NITV, and I'll also discuss with Foreign Office how we can involve and conduct some of these hackathons to involve the youth to use the technology to promote these initiatives. One thing that we will be doing is conducting internal workshops of the officials who are working it, and then we will be involving Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these platforms, and I think we will. There's definitely opportunity to also convert it into a hackathon and come up with some kind of innovative solution.
Thank you, Imran. Does any of the panelists want to answer this question, or should we move forward to the next one?
So it's a really interesting idea and very out of the box, as Ghazali Saab mentioned as well. It is definitely something that can be looked into. And if a format can be put in place where we have multiple information coming in from the civil society, then it will definitely bring an added value to the conduct of diplomacy. In a way, actually, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is already engaged in somewhat a similar stream, and which is not really a hackathon, but which is consultation with the civil society and partnership with think tanks, with like IPRI, like ISSI, and some other big names that we have in Pakistan. And the idea behind these interactions is to have an outsider perspective into foreign policy problems. So as foreign policy practitioners, we do tend to see things very closely and in a way which is probably which excludes a lot of other points of views, because of course we are also limited in our reactions. So there is a certain strength that can be brought in by civil society actors which are not so constrained, and which can bring in these fresh angles and ideas to diplomacy and diplomatic problems. So it is definitely something that can be looked into.
Thank you, Ikra. The next question is from Maha Tariq, and this question is directed towards Ikra and Imran. And she says that the things mentioned are, for now, the to-dos. I'm assuming that the programs that you mentioned. What time frame are you looking for these programs and proposals to be fully implemented?
So actually, the interesting part is, sorry, Ghazali Saab, you want to go first?
No, it's fine. You go ahead.
Okay, so the interesting part is that these are not to-dos. These are actually things which are in process, and this isn't a wish list that we have. This is something which is already in the pipelines. So if you had asked me this question even 6 months back, then definitely it would have been a to-do. But in the past couple of months, we have actually made a huge progress in implementing these ideas and moving from theoretical frameworks to actual practical side of things. So the time frame that we have is that it is already happening, and we just want to consolidate it a little bit more. And the infrastructure is in place, and we're already using it. So in the current, for example, I will take a non-controversial example. Women's Day has just passed on 8th of March, and we ran a campaign across all of our handles, social media handles, to actually project women of Pakistan. This was the first time that we actually celebrated Women's Day in a manner which was coordinated, in a manner which was centralized. There was this message from the Minister of Foreign Affairs which was disseminated across all these social media digital handles, and it was transformed into a campaign. So we plan to run these campaigns, and we want to amplify these campaigns in future. And we have already run 3 campaigns in the past 2 months alone. So we want to increase the frequency of this. We want to increase the effectiveness of it. But we are already doing all of these things.
Thank you, Ikra. Oh, yes, Imran, please go ahead.
Yep, I think just add on to that, as Ikra said. So in terms of organizing the foreign missions accounts. The Foreign Office has already worked on them. The 25 of those accounts have also been verified, and I think the next batch of accounts should also be done. So, people will also start seeing the results in a more impactful manner very soon. And already, the recent PM's visit to Sri Lanka, there was a very good coordination with all the foreign missions of Pakistan and with the Foreign Office, and it was highlighted in a very good manner. So it's already in process, and people will see the impact of this, in the coming days and months.
Thank you, Imran. We have an overwhelming number of questions, but however, due to the time constraints, I'm going to take this question, 2 questions at one time as the last. So I'm going to put a set out, and then the panelists can answer the question. So this question is specifically for IPRI, and the question says that IPRI mentioned that leaders and foreign missions and diplomats can leverage unfettered reactions from the people to their own advantage. But is there a formal technique for a method to use popular opinions online? For instance, Trudeau was criticized during his visit to India for cultural appropriation, which he thought was a positive move. If there is no method to understand how positively and negatively people might react, how do diplomats form a concrete approach to digitalization?
It's a very interesting question, and it is not something which is new to a diplomat's life, actually. Since we joined service, we are sensitized to the local and cultural sensitivities. It is very, very important. In some cultures, it is okay if you do not greet them first. In some cultures, it is not okay. In some cultures, it is okay if you ask about their family or their incomes, and in some cultures, it is not. In some cultures, people are more friendly, and in some cultures people are more self-constrained. So it is very, very important to be able to read the local sentiments of wherever the target message is going, and it is not done at a whim. Nothing about a diplomat's words or actions is actually reactionary or not thought out, because every single thing, every single word that is uttered, every single event that is planned is placed in its entire context. That what is the messaging, what will be the what is the intended messaging, and what can be the unintended consequences of this messaging. All of that is mapped. So we are already doing that in the physical sphere, and putting it across in the digital sphere was not very, very difficult, because it was just a matter of translating from one to the other. So it is definitely something that is always at the back of our minds, and everybody knows the power of trolls. So we want to keep away from them as much as possible, and we try our best to do so.
Thank you, IPRI. With this, we move to the end of the question and answer session. I now request Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, the acting president of IPRI, to please give the concluding remarks.
Thanks, Kashum. I think a very absorbing session. And I think this format change in the tinkering that we did was a great success. And I congratulate all the distinguished panelists for a very enlightening discourse. Here I'm reminded of Mark Twain's quote that I read long time ago. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. So that's a verity that we all who are engaged in strategic communications endeavor and public, economic, and cultural diplomacy should be our current of. Some of the very important takeaways from this discourse are the linkage between reality and communication pointed out by Uzair Yunus with a lot of perspicacity. I think that's a reality, that the comm side and the reality creating side, sorry for want of a better word, this is the only coin as reality creating, which is the civil society, which is the government, need to create an enabling environment to spawn a culture of high trust. I'm reminded of a book on the high trust societies by one of the writers. And the gist of the discourse was that high trust societies inspire confidence, and the economic productivity is a consequence of that trust. So that linkage we have to create, and that would be a great help to our strategic communication and public diplomats also. Now, there was a point about the reputational risk, because once we go into those risk management courses and discourses, one of the most serious risks that they point out is not a risk of a catastrophic failure of a dam or a structure. The most catastrophic risk is the reputational risk, that we don't need to get into a wrong building of perceptions, which would actually boomerang on us. So one of the arts of strategic communication, public diplomacy, is that we go for the right building of the image. And for that, I think that would be a strong bulwark against a reputational risk if we take that fact into cognizance. IPRI pointed out with a lot of pre-science, I think there's a need of investment in the digital media toolkit and human resource to rebrand Pakistan for its geo-economic potential instead of geopolitical. And I think nothing could be far from right, because these are the tools in which we need to invest to increase the speed and velocity of our communications. And I'm reminded of Bill Gates' book that I read 10 years ago, Business at the Speed of Thought. And in that, the first chapter and the first quote was that for successful business entrepreneurs, the speed and the digital use of the IT technology is the great differentiator. So whether we go for cultural diplomacy, whether we go for student art, student exchange programs, whether we go for our digital diplomacy, leveraging all these tools, the overarching message is that there should be two streams should be linked. One is the products part and one is the com part. And then the age has come that we leverage all the new modern tools. And for that, we have to create, if we have to compete in the marketplace of ideas, we need marketplace warriors. And those warriors we have to, build by way of building their capacity by equipping them with the necessary tools. So with this, I think we stand wiser, and I'm sure that each one of us is carrying some real nuggets of information, which will come in very handy in making any future policy prescription. And we look forward to several other interactions like that with the distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With this, we come to the end of the webinar. I personally really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope all our viewers also found the discussion as insightful and knowledgeable. A note of thanks for our speakers for taking out time for this webinar. For our participants, please make sure to follow IPRI on its social media platforms to keep tabs on events, publications, and research work. Thank you.